Leonidas is the best investment in the whole of Rise of Kingdoms, or at least I would have said that 3 years ago when he first released, but now as of 2023, that's just not the case. You look at Leonidas, you're like, well, his kit's very average, he loses in like every single battle he's in, and this is just evidence of commanders aging. Over time, every single commander is going to fall out the meta, even CPOs, Yulang, Nevsky, Hao Bing, all these commanders will eventually fall out of the meta and just become pretty much obsolete. So today, I'll be discussing commander aging and how long can you expect a commander to last in the meta, what puts a commander in the meta to begin with, and the average lifespan of a commander. How long really can you expect them to last, like I said before? How long will CPO be a good commander until he's replaced by some unknown mystery commander? So if you're interested in the real potential of commanders and how long they're going to last, how to make the best investments, you want to check out the rest of the video. To start off with, before we understand how long a commander takes to be in the meta, let's learn about what puts a commander in the meta. And the first thing is their damage factor and the damage they're dealing. Damage factor, while a lot of people say it doesn't matter, is still a very important thing. If you look at a commander's kit and they got low damage, for example, Ramses at the max can deal 2000 damage factor, they're not going to be in the meta. You look at their kit, you're like, well, they're lacking on damage. A commander like Yulang literally does Ramses damage, but an AoE to 5 people. And you'd be like, oh, well, that's probably one of the main reasons Yulang's in the meta, and you'd be right. A commander like YSG is a shining example of this. When he first released, the only reason he was in the meta is not because he had any fancy stats, not because he had any fancy debuffs, it's because he had crazy 5-target AoE with, I guess, the skill damage is technically a stat, but it is literally just a DPS stat. So damage does matter in Rise of Kingdoms, and it is a great way to get a gauge of how well a commander might perform on the open field. But it's not the only thing. Stats also matter. The amount of stats and the type of stats a commander is getting is extremely important. A commander like Boudica Prime, one of the reasons she's in the meta is because she's like one of the most stat-heavy archer commanders. She's loaded with stats on 2 of her skills. She's got an expertise with decent amount of stats. She's got stats on her 4th skill. She's also got an amazing debuff, which is another thing that makes a commander really, really good. You look at a commander and you're like, well, they've got a lot of stats and a lot of damage factor. Doesn't necessarily mean they're in the meta. It is a key thing, but if they've got really good debuffs, that's what really seals the deal. You look at Boudica Prime, she's got a 35% skill damage taken increase on her opponent and a mark speed reduction. So you look at her and you're like, well, she's loaded with debuffs, she's loaded with damage factor, she's loaded with stats. That is definitely 3 key reasons why you'll see that's why she's in the meta. She's got all those 3 main things. Then you've got 3 a little bit more niche things. First of all, are they providing buffs? Are they providing some type of literal buff to your meta? For example, Trajan. Trajan's a commander that released almost 3 years ago, and the reason he's even close to the meta is because he just provides amazing buffs to your meta. Not because he's dealing damage, not because he has amazing debuffs, not because he even has amazing stats. His overall stats are not that amazing. The reason he's in there is because he's bringing a lot of buffs. Then, do they also provide some extremely unique utility with specific commanders? And the best example of this is Artemisia. She was a commander released in like 2019 or 2020 when Ramses came out, and she works extremely well with Boudica Prime now in 2023. And the reason that is because she provides extremely unique utility with her 4th skill. Everyone would look at Artemisia after she was released and be like, well, she's a fairly decent commander at the time, she was the best garrison, but now you look at her and you're like, she's not that good. But when they put Boudica Prime out, she was amazing and she worked extremely well. She was the best Boudica Prime player purely because she provided extremely good utility with Boudica Prime. And then in the contrary, are they a generic commander in terms of can their field and their kit be used with almost anyone? A good example of this is just straight up Saladin. You look at Saladin's kit, extremely tanky, lots of stats. He's really a primary commander who can work with almost anyone. He can work with William, he can work with Joan, he can work with Nevsky, he can work with Hao Bing, he can work with Zhang Yu. So many commanders that you can see Saladin work with, and that's a reason that he's still somewhat in the meta. It's because of how generic he is, and in a good way. His genericness is a reason that he actually stays in the meta. So those are really the kind of like 6 key reasons of why a commander stays in the meta. But now, how long do you expect a commander to last in the meta? And we'll start off with a couple of examples. Guan Yu released in March of 2020, and he is, in my opinion, starting to fall out of the meta now. And the reason he stayed in the meta, he had extremely good debuffs and extremely good damage factor. His stats were fairly low, he worked extremely well with specific commanders, but overall, he lasted around 3 years. Then we got a commander such as Constantine, who in my opinion fell out of the meta around 2 years ago, so he released 2019 and he lasted until around 2021. So he provided a lot of buffs and he was an extremely tanky commander, but his damage factor was low. His stats are kind of low compared to the modern commanders and he didn't provide any debuffs. So the first thing we've noticed is a commander that's got good damage factor and a commander that's bringing extremely unique debuffs plus has a fairly good primary and works well with a lot of different commanders is going to last around 3 years. So the first thing we can say is with pretty good confidence, commanders such as Scipio, commanders such as Boudica Prime, commanders such as Nevsky and Hao Bing are going to last around 3 years each. They are meta primary commanders for their troop type, and you'll be able to run them for 3 years. This does not necessarily mean they're going to be the meta investment for 3 years. I would expect in 2 years from now Nevsky to not be in the meta investments. I would expect 2 years from now Hao Bing to not be a meta investment. And the same for Boudica, the same for Scipio. They are eventually not going to be meta investments, but they will still be extremely well-performing commanders in around 3 years from now. After those 3 years, we can expect these commanders to become slightly less effective on the open field. For example, now, Guan Yu, he trades well in very good, in situations, certain situations where he's performing well, but in some situations, you'll notice he gets absolutely flogged. So, looking at a commander similar to Guan, who is a very, very good primary, works well with a lot of commanders, provides unique debuffs, they're going to last around 3 years at the max. Now, I'm going to say, though, since Lilith is kind of pumping out commanders a lot quicker, a commander like Scipio, a commander like Boudica, and a commander like Nevsky is probably actually only going to last around 2 and 2.5 years max. Lilith is literally pumping out a full commander cycle in around 9 months. When Guan was released, it was like every 12 months you get a full commander cycle, so 1 year. So I would say within the next year or so, Nevsky's not going to be the meta investment, and then half a year from that, when the next cycle hits, he's probably going to be fairly out of the meta. And the same can be said with Boudica, and the same can be said with Scipio. Now, this 2 to 3 year time frame of commanders like Scipio, Boudica, and Nevsky is actually not set in stone, because this can be changed if a commander releases with similar kits to Scipio, but does it better. For example, Gilgamesh was released in I think 2022, and he lost his effectiveness in 2022. So maybe in 2021, he lasted around 5 or 6 months in the meta before Scipio Prime released, because Scipio Prime took away Gilgamesh's most prized possession. Scipio Prime took away the active skill health debuff and made it actually better in an AoE. So Gilgamesh, shining example of a commander who just got unlucky. You would have looked at Gilgamesh's kit back then, you'd been like, wow, he's a very good commander for the open field. He's providing a really unique debuff. If you're running 3 or so Archers, he is a must-have. You look at him now, he's his debuff has been taken by Scipio. His damage factor is extremely low compared to the god tier commanders that released after him. And the only other debuff he provides is a heal, damage debuff. So really, as soon as Scipio was released, Gilgamesh was kicked out of the meta, and that is literally only because you look at his kit and you're like, well, his most powerful thing was taken away less than a year after he was released. So you may get extremely unlucky in cases such as Gilgamesh in unpredictable situations when no one expected another commander with a health debuff as potent as Gilgamesh's to release, but it happened. So if that happens, you can expect their commander to fall out of the meta in around a year or so as the new commander takes all their utility and becomes the new shiny meta thing. Now, the final thing that changes this 2 to 3 year cycle is actually if that commander works really well as a secondary. Lilith often likes to work around the secondary commanders that have been in the game. For example, ZHUGE has been released, and I would predict almost 100% certainly the next Archer commanders that release will work extremely well with ZHUGE because he is the secondary commander for Archers at the moment. For example, when Boudica was released, Artemisia was one of the best secondaries in the game, still with a Manatori. Boudica was the best primary to Artemisia because they worked around the Artemisia. Boudica's kit is almost picture perfect for something you would want for Artemisia. When Nebu was released, they worked around YSG, who was the meta secondary at the time. So if your commander is a secondary, you can expect them to get a lot more value. So ZHUGE will probably last 3 to 4 years because of how good of a secondary he is, and since he can work with pretty much any tanky primary, it is extremely easy to get that boost. Joan of Arc is another example of this. They released Nevsky, and then they worked around the Nevsky giving the Joan of Arc, and they've worked around Joan of Arc with Hao Bing, and I'd predict the next Cavs that release are going to work extremely well with Joan of Arc. So you can predict Joan of Arc, an extremely potent and powerful secondary, to last around 3 to 4 years on the open field as the best Cav secondary. Because even if they release another cavalry secondary, they often release a lot more primaries between rally commanders and open field commanders. So you'll see that the secondary commanders don't get phased out as quickly, so they will last a little bit longer. The only disadvantage to this is if they are a very specific secondary and they only work with specific commanders, then they won't last as long. For example, Takeda literally only worked with Attila and does not work with anyone else. He somewhat worked with Saladin for a year, but after that was really trash. So Takeda with Attila, only with Attila, and then he's literally out of the meta. So if they are very, very catered kits, so Takeda is a really good example. Artemisia would have been a really good example, but they definitely worked around her a little bit. Then you will notice that they fall out of the meta a little bit quickly. The final thing that allows a commander to stay in the meta is if they are extremely unique or very special. A great example of this is just Trajan. Trajan released, I think, in 2021, and he is still extremely meta. He is part of the best buffing march in the whole entire game, and you literally cannot get any better version. There is nothing that comes even close to Trajan. currently in the game. And so you would expect him to stay in the meta even if they released another Trajan-like commander for another 3 years from now, because even if they release another Trajan-like commander, you can just put Trajan with that commander. It's going to be a meta march, and since it's a buffing march, it's extremely specified, so you would expect Trajan to, for that specific category of being a buffing march, to stay in the meta for 3 years. Also, if they are like extremely support-based, a great example of this, Tamiris, they're going to stay in the meta for a while. Tamiris' debuffs are all on passive skill slots. Her damage factor obviously is not completely up to standard, but he's still dealing enough damage and has amazing debuffs to the point where she's going to stay in the meta for probably another year. So that's going to give her like a 4-year age cycle, even after Sargon's release. Because Sargon, yeah, he's got the same debuffs as Tamiris, they're just much harder to access. So if they're providing some extremely unique utility and there's no other commanders like it, then they're going to stay in the meta for quite a while, especially for the open field. Now, here is the final summarized breakdown of how long a commander can really last in the meta. First of all, with a tanky primary commander, where no other commanders are really released that take away their kit, for example, Boudica Prime, no one releases another version that does a skill damage increase on their active skill, then you can expect them to stay in the meta for up to 3 years, depending on how good their debuffs are, and depending on the good secondaries or better primaries that they get. Then you can expect a commander whose debuffs and utility are taken away from them by a better commander to last around 1 year. Best example of this is Gilgamesh after Scipio took away his health debuff. So if their kit is taken away, so if someone took away Boudica's skill damage debuff, you'll expect them to last only 1 year as an open field meta commander. Then if they are a secondary commander, especially the best secondary of the type that you've seen, especially in quite a while, you can expect them to last up to 5 years. YSG is going on his 5th year and is still one of the best archer secondaries in the game, and I would expect ZHUGE to last almost 5 years because he is extremely generic and works extremely well as a secondary commander. Then if they're extremely specified or an extremely specific commander that work extremely well in extremely specific situations, lots of extremelies there, then you'll expect them to once again last almost around 5 years. Great example of this, Tamiris and Gilgamesh. And then finally, a commander with a very specific kit such as Artemisia should only last in the meta for 1 year, but if you get extremely lucky, as in the case of Artemisia where they keep being revived, especially since they're a secondary commander, they can last up to 3 years. Artemisia, when I first looked at her kit, I would have said 1 year, 2 years max, but then they put her with pretty much a Tamiris, and Tamiris was the best debuffing march and DPS march at the time, so you put her with Artemisia, it was one of the best marches. Then that march started to fall off, and then they made a Minotaur and that revived Artemisia again, and then that fell off, and then they made Boudica Prime and that revived Artemisia again. So you can see that commanders such as Artemisia, you may get extremely lucky, and they last much longer. Now, obviously, just because a commander is completely out of the meta doesn't mean they can't come back in. In situations like Artemisia, they are not completely out of the meta, but then a primary commander does revitalize them. But in a situation like Mehmed, he was completely out of the meta. He is not a good field commander until he got his Museum Relic in around, I think it was 2 years ago. And you can expect a Museum Relic to really revitalize a commander. Museum Relics give a commander around another year or 2 years of proper open field effectiveness for one tier of a Museum Relic. The second tier can add another year to 2 years on this, depending on how powerful it is. YSG is a good example of this. He was really falling out of the meta, and then they slapped him with his Museum Relics, and now he's still a very good and decent field commander, who if you run him, you can expect to still get a decent trade. A commander such as Mehmed is another example. Like I said before, no one was running Mehmed until his Museum Relic came out, and then he got pumped up with a crack load of stats, and now he's one of the best secondaries in the game. So Museum Relics can really shift how a commander is going and the trajectory they're heading. For example, another one, Alexander the Great, was completely going off course. His Museum Relic has kind of brought him a little bit back into the meta. If you did have him, the unlock is fairly nice, and it's going to give him a decent amount of stats. So Museum Relics can give another year to 2 years on effectiveness, if not more in the case of double relics that are extremely powerful, such as Mehmed and Minamoto being like the main two, and even Caesar. So a commander who's fully out of the meta will get a Museum Relic at one point, in my opinion. I reckon after the Season 2 commanders, they're going to start releasing Artemisia and Ramses relics, and then they'll release Guan relics, and then they'll release like Cav relics, and they'll just continue going on and on through all the generations of commanders as they continue to fall out of the meta and be brought back into the meta. So museums do kind of throw a spanner into the works in predicting how long a commander will last, because they can add another 2 to 3 years on the commander effectiveness. Even the oldest commanders in the game now are still fairly usable purely because of it. Now, if you enjoyed today's video, I'd like to mention I'm doing a live stream tomorrow at 4 UTC. So if you want to drop by, I'll be doing some Ark of Osiris and I'll be doing some Champions of Olympia. All those live streams are always a fun and very relaxed time. So if you want to just relax, watch some YouTube, chat with me, maybe ask me a couple of questions, consider dropping by. The link will be in the pinned comment and in the description. Now, I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope to see you in the next one.